If you want clear skin and a healthy gut, stop with all the detoxes. If you have skin problems like rashes, eczema, or acne, detoxes can easily backfire, adding more stress to your body, leaving you worse off than you were before.
In terms of detoxes, I would recommend avoiding probably most of them. I would rather people focus on what they could add in that would be sustainable for a long-term solution to support their health.
What you need to do instead is support your liver and optimize your gut.
The entire focus is simply just to shut off the symptoms, but not deal with the underlying issue by addressing the gut microbiome and slowly reducing the inflammatory components there. We start to see this distance being created between each skin infection.
Skin and gut expert Jennifer Fugo is here to tell us how.
It's about looking at the right combination of nutrients and really feeding the system. If somebody is looking for an answer to what to eat, the first thing would be to
Welcome to the Health Optimization Podcast. I'm Tim Gray, the UK's leading biohacker. This podcast is all about gaining actionable advice from the world's top experts and sharing new breakthroughs in nature, biohacking, technology, and longevity research to help you live longer and happier. Everything I cover on this podcast are the things I've learned from the world's top medical professionals, researchers, scientists, and authors in the health field. However, I'm none of those things. I'm just someone with a very keen mind for figuring out how to be as healthy as possible while aging gracefully and learning from the best. My only bias is health. People who've experienced issues like eczema, psoriasis, rosacea, dandruff, or hives have probably tried everything to clear up their skin. But did that steroid cream from the doctors actually work? The reality is you don't have a skin product deficiency. You probably have a gut or liver problem. But when it comes to optimizing your health, detoxes and elimination diets may be doing more harm than good. That's why I've brought Jennifer Fugo onto the show to tell us what we can do to fix our guts and get flawless skin. Jennifer is a clinical nutritionist helping her patients to beat chronic skin and unending gut challenges. She's also got her own line of skincare and supplements and hosts the Healthy Skin Show podcast. She got into the science of skincare after being let down by the medical industry when she was facing her own health challenges. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, what was the catalyst that got you interested in the link between gut health and skin health?
Well, it would be that I ended up with eczema, a specific type of eczema called dyshidrotic eczema, where your hands and feet, but fortunately this only impacted my hands, where your skin becomes extremely dried out and you develop what become like these almost little bubbles filled with a fluid under the skin that then eventually becomes insanely itchy, burst open, and your skin's super flared up. It then eventually will heal up, and you go through this awful cycle over and over and over again. And I was in my master's program for human nutrition at the time when I developed this, and I got to a place where I had no hope that I was actually going to get it to stop because it was getting worse and worse and worse. And the doctors just wanted me to use steroid creams. They had talked about other potential options that could be down the road if it wasn't contained enough for my liking. But basically, it was just sort of this mentality of you're going to have to learn how to manage this. You're just going to have to live with it. There's nothing more you can do. I know that you've done all the diet things, but that's not going to fix this. And to be honest with you, when you start to realize that your quality of life and the things that we take for granted, like being able to turn a doorknob, being able to take care of simple chores, like I know that you're a big fan of weight training. I had to stop weight training because I couldn't hold dumbbells. I couldn't wash my hands. So it was really severely impacting my quality of life. And that's where, out of desperation, I started to dig deeper and say, what else could be going on here? So that really was the impetus and the inspiration for me to get curious, shall we say.
I love that. It's funny because a lot of the guests that I interview or people I meet or speakers or the authors have all stumbled across their area of expertise because of their own need. And they've gone so deep into it because it's the biggest motivation, isn't it? I mean, it's why I'm in biohacking, because I had to figure the stuff out. And so it's really, really nice when you hear a personal journey because you're absolutely invested in figuring out the best way around these things. So for people that don't suffer with skin issues, it might seem like a small issue, but people with chronic skin problems are more likely to have depression and suicidal thoughts. So this isn't small by any means, is it?
No, this is a really huge shift in life. And depending on what type of skin condition you have, it will impact your life in different ways. Another skin issue that I also dealt with that fortunately I believe is in remission at this point was hidradenitis suppurativa, which most people haven't heard of. And granted, it sounds like some crazy monster out of a fantasy movie. But basically, it's where you start to develop what feel like these really huge boils near the sebaceous glands in different areas of the body. So mine impacted my armpits, but it can also impact the face, like around the jawline, under the breast, the groin area. And especially for those where it impacts the groin can be extremely painful because it's like sitting on a hard golf ball. And these boils almost, they can end up bursting, and it's just extremely painful. What it does to the skin is extremely painful. And I was lucky enough to be able to so I was in sort of a phase 1 level of dealing with HS. And I was able to use, believe it or not, laser hair removal, got it to stop. I wasn't in one of the later phases where it no longer works and where surgery a lot of times or biologic drugs and other things may be the only option people have. But there's so much out there that's changing, especially in the last 5 years. These things impact not just somebody's ability to show up to work, they can impact your ability to be a good parent, to continue and finish school, to just live your daily life and be able to take trips. I mean, I am not joking. To anyone who is struggling with something like this, you know exactly how much you have to almost give up in order to sometimes accommodate pain, flare-ups that come out of the blue, being afraid to go out to eat or to travel because you don't know what the hotel washed the sheets with. There's so many facets to how skin issues can impact your life that absolutely can play a role in anxiety, depression, and possibly even feeling suicidal when cases are really, really severe.
I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's like, for instance, if you have these issues going on, and for instance, I had, frequent urination for many years, and I was going 30 to 50 times a day, no exaggeration, and no one could help me. They just said, drink more water because you're dehydrating. But it was depressing. I couldn't get out of the house. I was like worried about where I was going to be if I was going to pretty much pee my pants. So it was pretty extreme. And it's like that becomes depressing in itself. But I think when it's obviously you're talking about skin health, which, we get into about how it's related to the gut properly, but gut, neurotransmitters, brain health, brain function in itself is, if it's not correct, you're going to be depressed or anxious or have OCD or any of these things. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if you have these skin conditions, it's also going to bring that on. So it is a double-edged sword, I feel.
It is. It also is not just these environmental and situational facets to the picture, because there is also overlap with cytokines, the inflammatory messengers of the body. Specifically, we see that research with psoriasis, where certain cytokines, as they increase in that particular skin condition, we also see comorbidities. Like psoriasis has a very distinct depression and anxiety as comorbidities. And those cytokines are also, they're the same. They're elevated in those conditions. So there may be an immunologic component to why someone may also feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Same with dental health when they find interleukin 6, actually, very same. And we discussed this with Dr. Dom Nitschwitz a few weeks ago, actually. So it's awesome. So on this podcast, we've already heard about leaky gut and leaky gums from Dr. Dom, but you're here to tell us why and more about leaky skin. So could you define leaky skin for us?
Leaky skin is similar to the concept of leaky gut, where the skin barrier, which should be, if you imagine a brick wall, and the mortar mix in between each brick is really nice and sealed, so nothing from the outside can get in. That's what ideally we want to some degree. With leaky skin, that mortar mix between the bricks or the cells is not great. Let's put it that way. And that the mortar mix is something called filaggrin. Our body has a gene, it's called the profilaggrin gene, that produces an enzyme. The enzyme thus produces this protein called filaggrin, which something to the effect, like I believe 13% of filaggrin is made up of a very specific amino acid called L-histidine. And L-histidine is something important that we do need to get from our dietary intake, but we can't just blame nutrient deficiencies for the lack of, or even possibly this faulty production of filaggrin, which is there to help keep the barrier nice and sealed, right? It's sort of like that mortar mix. And so one of the facets that can cause the filaggrin production to go awry is internal inflammation. So increased cytokines, because I think that's important to define for people. We talk a lot about inflammation, but we don't really know what it is. And it sounds like Dr. Dom touched on that by mentioning IL-6. But internal inflammation that's triggered by cytokines, so these inflammatory messengers that are essentially your body's way of recruiting immune help into a particular area to try to deal with a problem. Usually it's some sort of pathogen, overgrowth, or some sort of, we'll just say, quote unquote, invader that can happen, but we can certainly have overgrowths as well. That process of those inflammatory messengers going out into the body can cause the enzyme that makes filaggrin to essentially make a really poor quality of filaggrin. So yes, you can have a genetic SNP that could cause your body naturally to produce lesser quality or poorer quality filaggrin. But we can't discount the nutritional piece to this, which means what does our L-histidine amino acid supply look like? And what does our inflammatory piece internally look like? Because they also play a role. So ideally, when we're thinking about the skin barrier, that's the internal component. And then certainly external components can also degrade that barrier. So having overgrowths or imbalances on the skin of certain microbes like Staphylococcus aureus, that is very, very inflammatory. And some people will have some staph living on their skin. And it's specific to Staph aureus. There's all different types of staph that can live on the skin, even like Staph epidermis, which is not as big of a concern. Staph aureus produces toxins that degrade the filaggrin in the skin barrier and cause a whole host of inflammation that can thus precipitate this problem. So we can have outside in problems as well as inside out. And so I don't think that we can just point to one thing. And that's something that I really try to impress upon my community and clients and people that are, work with my team, is that we have to look at the different angles to help one figure out what's causing this whole system to go off kilter. When we look for just that one thing, oftentimes we find that dealing with the one thing, or the thing you want to be the one thing, isn't all that helpful. That a lot of times we need to have this multi-pronged approach that could include environmental toxins and other things in your environment. I'm sure your community is also well aware of mycotoxins and all sorts of stuff from the outside that can impact the skin as well.
I did some content on Instagram a few months ago now, and it was talking about why not to use typical traditional body cream and why it's bad for your health. And I said, your skin is like a sponge. And I had some form of chemist or product formulator with all sorts of letters after his name and everything, tore me down, said I was full of absolute BS, that the skin is not like a sponge and different areas of the body have different absorption rates and the chemicals that they put in these things don't get into our bloodstream. However, the reason why I did the piece was because I had seen some studies and data behind where these chemicals that are in the skin cream end up in the urine that the people are excreting, even though he called me out and said I was the biggest fraud in the world and didn't know what I was talking about, because, the skin doesn't allow things in. My argument is on a simple layer is, well, you get transdermal medicines which penetrate the skin and get into the body, such as testosterone replacement cream, for instance. That works very quickly. Mm-hmm. I've tested it myself. And various other skin application painkillers and things like that. So I just love to hear your opinion on this guy's teardown of me saying that, your skin is like a sponge.
I can see where he's coming from, that maybe what he objects to the most is really the analogy. I would say that the skin is not necessarily the largest organ, but it's an important organ. And like most tissue, it has the ability to be impacted by what is touching it, what it is exposed to. And what we do know is that from regular skin creams, I mean, this is such a huge, broad conversation. But we do know that the way that most conventional products are formulated is to keep the user using it. It's not to deal with the problem so that by the time you get to the end of the bottle, you're done. We want, at least in the United States, we want repeat users. So there are ingredients in these products that can facilitate the eventual drying out. Like, so if you're using a moisturizer, they can increase the drying out of the skin. Not that it's going to make your skin worse per se, but that you'll need to reapply. You'll need to reapply. And you're like, oh, this seems to work. You keep buying these products that are filled with chemicals and things that, and look, not all chemicals are necessary. Everything is a chemical to some degree. So we have to be careful about how we easily or simply demonize different things. But I will say this. We do know that you can apply vitamin D to the skin and it will be absorbed. We do know that you can apply vitamin A to the skin. So fatty acids can be absorbed, and those are just nutrients. So to simply dismiss that chemicals don't have the same capacity to be absorbed, it depends. I mean, if you apply zinc to your skin, it's not necessarily going to make it into the broader nutritional stores, but it will end up impacting the skin cells themselves. So I think it's a bigger conversation, but I also feel like I want to be able to make the decision about the things that my skin comes in contact with. So I would prefer not to purchase products that have parabens and other products and ingredients in them that I'm just not comfortable using. And I don't think that any person should be shamed into using a product that they don't feel comfortable with. We're allowed to ask the question, why or how is this working? And at the end of the day, if you don't feel comfortable with it and you'd prefer something that's more natural, that's on you. The only thing I will say is that when you have a very compromised skin barrier, I mean, he's talking about healthy skin. What happens if you don't have healthy skin? What happens if you have broken skin because of eczema or psoriasis or one of these other skin conditions? What you apply will now have access to your body because that exterior skin barrier is broken. And we do know, and looking at research, and I've interviewed a lot of dermatologists and allergy experts on this, that the belief now is that especially in childhood and as babies, the potential to trigger food allergies is not by eating the foods. It's by applying them to the skin, and that the introduction to the immune system is through the skin. So, I mean, I think you make a very valid argument, and I share your concern. And I think if perhaps we all took a step back and looked at this from a variety of different perspectives, perhaps we all might find some common ground.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for drilling into that, because it had been bugging me for a while, and I got a lot of hate for it, like really a lot of hate. And I just think it's criminal. Actually, there was a lip balm I heard about a year ago that has the chemical to dry out your lips, so you keep on applying it more and keep on buying it more. And people say, "Oh, I don't know why. I just seem to need this. I need lip balm." The thing is, they're hooked on it forever because there's chemicals in it to dry your lips out. And I just like, its industry is just insane. It's like it's mis-selling. It's like selling something to make your lips moist, but actually it's drying out. So it's actually the anti-product. It's just crazy. So can you tell the listeners how the skin microbiome communicates with the gut flora? Because this is an area that really interests me.
So I don't know if we have a ton of exact research and data right now to show this, but my thought, and this is from my clinical experience, that we know that there are different microbiomes throughout the body. There's the gut microbiome, and then we have microbiomes obviously on the skin. We have a bladder microbiome, vaginal microbiome. There's an eye microbiome. There's all these beautiful microbiomes throughout the body. And I almost in this particular instance would categorize the oral microbiome as almost part of the gut microbiome, though I think some of the dentists that I have interviewed have said they feel like the nasal microbiome and the oral microbiome are almost like gateway microbiomes because that's an entry point. That being said, I have found that you can make positive impacts to the ability to one's skin microbiome to not tend toward dysbiosis by addressing gut microbiome dysbiosis. So obviously, if you go to the gym and you lay on a bench to lift your weights and there is MRSA, that's a different story, right? We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is somebody's skin microbiome that tends towards dysbiosis or an imbalanced state with an overgrowth of staph or strep or pseudomonas or something like that. But what I have seen is because I work with so many eczema clients who are struggling with chronic infections, so they are constantly on and off antibiotics, and not just topical antibiotics. It's to the point where they actually need oral antibiotics because the infections come on so quickly and they need to jump on top of them that a topical antibiotic simply isn't enough. That with time, by addressing the gut microbiome and slowly reducing the inflammatory components there, we start to see this distance being created between each skin infection. Now, I'm not making a claim here that this is how you stop this. This is what I have seen clinically. There is some research that we may, like with psoriasis, for example, they've seen bacterial DNA in the blood of those who have psoriasis. And that bacterial DNA is actually coming from the GI tract. So we do know that there is some sort of gut permeability piece, at least through research. I personally have my own thoughts based on my own work. But we do see that. But then also we do produce short chain fatty acids like butyrate, acetate, and propionate. But butyrate, of course, is extremely important. And there may be some connection between those metabolites and potentially other lesser known metabolites that our gut bacteria produce that may also hold some sort of regulatory piece to this. But I do think that if you're struggling with recurrent skin infections, I realize that for somebody hearing this for the first time, it might sound like a total reach because you're like, well, my gut is not near my skin. However, when you reduce the inflammatory triggers in the GI tract, you do reduce the inflammation throughout the system. And I have had multiple experts from Johns Hopkins University and Northwestern University on the Healthy Skin Show discussing that a lot of times the inflammatory triggers that can cause us to experience even itching may not actually originate on the skin, but someplace else. So it sort of is like the opposite of the statement about Vegas, like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But it's not like that with the gut. What happens in the gut doesn't necessarily stay there. And that's why I think it's so much more worthwhile to look deeper.
Remember, if you want to learn how to take control of your health and you're sick of traditional healthcare and temporary fixes, you should come to the Health Optimization Summit. You can join other like-minded enthusiasts and meet the world's leading minds in health, wellness, and science. You can even test out a load of groundbreaking health tech and latest supplements. Get your tickets at healthoptimization.com. What is the most shocking or surprising statistic that you know about skin health?
I would say one of the biggest shockers over the last year is that we relate itch, so itchy skin. We relate itchy skin oftentimes to histamine, excess histamine in the body, that we must have a problem with histamine. And I had noticed that wasn't necessarily the case. I had worked with all of these different clients who had come in, tried low histamine, the diet, they're on tons of antihistamines, and they just weren't getting any better. And so I had the pleasure and have become friends with Dr. Sean Quatra, who I believe he's now at the University of Maryland, but he was at Johns Hopkins University. And his whole focus is itch. He literally is like one of the world's biggest researchers on itch. And what he shared with me is that most itch that we experience has nothing to do with histamine. Yes, if you have like chronic hives or dermatographia, that is a histamine-driven reaction, though there can be other facets to this. But there is a whole, so what he was saying, which was really, really cool. And I think this again sort of ties into my last point about how we need to look at what's going on in the gut microbiome, is that the itch is really a signal. If we back out of what itch is, it's a signal. It's an impulse that goes up the vagus nerve, because we have this beautiful nerve that connects our brain to our GI tract. So it innervates all throughout the gut. And when we have things going awry in the GI tract, those signals are sent up to the brain. But how the brain interprets them may not end up being what we would prefer to experience. And itch is one of those particular signals that it can interpret this discomfort, this dysbiosis, pain, any type of inflammatory reaction happening in the GI tract could actually be, it literally could just be how your brain is interpreting what's happening someplace else. We think of it as itch, but it's not actually itch. Itch and pain aren't that far away from one another. So it's really, really fascinating. And there are cytokine pieces to this as well. They consider now IL-31 to be the quote unquote like master itch cytokine. Though I think it seems like they're still in the beginning stages of trying to figure out what exactly is generating that and where it comes from and how it fits into everything. But I find the connections between cytokines and skin issues and what happens in the GI tract and which organisms trigger which cytokines to be honestly the most fascinating of all of this.
It's amazing how the work behind, or the research and data behind cytokines is accelerating, really accelerating. I remember like back in 2015, it must have been, when I first heard about cytokines myself at a hyperbaric conference actually. And I was just like, he said, the guy I was speaking to said, you must look into cytokines, and there's so much interesting stuff. And he said, here's the test, et cetera, et cetera. And then ever since then, it's kind of like spiraled, a bit like the microbiome research has incredibly like grown insane in the last 10 years. I feel like cytokines is also doing that. So what's your most controversial take when it comes to skin health?
My most controversial take would be that we need to start doing more than what we're currently doing. The conventional route is basically to manage symptoms. And I have talked with some doctors who feel that that is like the elephant in the room. We're not asking that question. We're not looking under those stones. Unfortunately, we are looking just to manage people's symptoms and to get them out of these potentially horrific states of being, because their skin is so painful, their skin barrier is so degraded. But the reality is that the entire focus is simply just to shut off the symptoms, but not deal with the underlying issue. And if we're really serious about talking about chronic inflammation and dealing with chronic inflammation, like what is the consequence of allowing for that inflammatory process to continue and to snowball for years and years and maybe decades of somebody's life?
I once heard a quote actually on Instagram, which stuck with me. It's amazing how much of an influence that has on me sometimes. It's like, symptoms are sacred messengers telling you to pay attention to something. So if you're just shutting up those symptoms, something's going to go wrong. There's a cause and effect to everything. So I think it's just interesting, isn't it? Oh, interleukin whatever is up, let's block it.
Exactly.
It's like, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Tim, it's like taking your car. If you jump in today to go someplace and all of the lights pop on the dashboard, it's like just unplugging whatever wires cause the lights to go on. It doesn't solve the underlying problem. The problem is still there. It's just we've turned the check engine signals off. And I do tell people, I think that there's something to be said for considering the level of suffering that someone is experiencing. So I want to be very clear that I don't have any judgment if someone chooses to use a medication along the way, because for some of these conditions, like if you have psoriasis and you start developing joint problems, so it's headed towards psoriatic arthritis where you're having joint issues. Once the joints are damaged, they can't fix that. So there can sometimes be something to utilizing the tools that the pharmaceutical company can provide. That being said, it is also an opportunity to look under the hood and do the work while perhaps you are not experiencing as life challenging and life changing symptoms that really make it difficult for you to be the person that you want to be. You can do both things at the same time, and you can eventually, I can't say 100% for all, but it is possible to come off of those medications without having a flare up. Because if you think about it, if you address what's driving the cytokines higher, then theoretically you should be able to get off the medication because you wouldn't necessarily need it anymore. And that is something that most people do not hear. They do not know. They think they have to either go like the natural route and deal with it with diet only once they get off the medication, but you can do them at the same time concurrently, which I think for so many people is really freeing to hear.
I love that you said that, to be quite honest, because there's a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy in everything, and that's a strategy in itself. But some people get stuck on the short-term strategy of symptoms and meds. And as a result, they don't think about the longer-term fix. And, for instance, to put it back to your car analogy with the service light, it's like, well, actually, you could put a bit of black tape over the light so that you don't see it while you're driving it. But to leave it there would be ridiculous. But having it for one journey because it's so bright in your eyes and you can't see where you're going. And I think, as with medications, I've used many medications. I'm a biohacker, so I prefer to be as natural as possible. But sometimes medications get you out of the crap very quickly. But for instance, if I work with a migraine every day, I would try and figure out why, which is actually what we've done in my family, opposed to just taking ibuprofen or Advil or paracetamol or whatever there is every day of your life. So I think that's where I think podcasts like this and yours and the information that we share on stages really helps wake people up to saying, you don't have to be on these drugs forever. It might help you in the short term, but look at the long term. And, healthy skin from the inside out, not just the outside in. It's okay to do both. So I really love that you said that.
And Tim, can I also just add to this? There are people who also fail with the diet-only approach. Like they'll go on these different diets. There's many different diets for different skin issues. And then there's obviously things like AIP. Now we have carnivore. We've got the keto diet. We have all these different diets that people will talk about in Facebook groups and whatnot. And there are a lot of people who fail with these diets, meaning that they do not get better. And that is okay. Some of these issues that we're talking about in terms of the cytokines are not necessarily diet fixable. So if someone is finding that they are maybe on medication or they're trying to avoid it and they're using diet as this like desperate last attempt, thinking that that's the only thing that they have left that they can control and do, that is not true. For example, let's just say you have severe candida overgrowth, right? And usually that's coupled with possibly, not always, but possibly depletion of good, healthy gut commensal organisms. You had a mold exposure for a period of time due to a house or a flat that you were living in, all of these different things. Food is only going to do so much. Food is medicine, but it can only do so much. And I just don't want someone to feel like they don't have any other opportunities to, as you say, biohack or work through and shift these different facets. Because in my practice, we're using antimicrobial herbs. Sometimes I recommend medications because something like an antibiotic or an antiparasitic medication or an antifungal medication can help somebody get a lot farther along. And then the herbs can really be beneficial. Again, with diet, with possibly maybe you need, like you said, the medication to help you in the meantime. But again, it's that idea that I'm just going to do this one thing and it should solve everything is not realistic. So and I just want people to know that.
I just want to say that this is perfect for my next question, because as we've established, you're not a fan of detoxes for clearing up skin and gut issues. Tell us why.
I'm not a fan of using detoxes and cleanses because a lot of people flare up, and they're also looked at as short-term solutions to a problem that has likely been there for a long time. So you cannot cleanse your gut. You actually can't really even cleanse your liver. Your liver has its own detoxification pathways, and it's not uncommon if you have pretty bad skin conditions. Even those with psoriasis may not find that these liver detoxes or cleanses are very helpful. The reality, when we look at what's happening under the surface, are the imbalances that drive or put other systems into overdrive. And so, number one, I don't want people to think that it's just this thing I need to do once a month or once a quarter or once a year, and then I'm good to go and I don't need to pay attention to what's happening to my body. There's also the concern that there's an exceptional number of individuals who develop food fear and all sorts of stigmas and strange eating relationships with their food that is not healthy. And you can't just say, oh, well, my skin's clear, so my fear of food is just naturally going to dissolve. That's not what happens. We have a tremendous number of people that have extremely disordered eating patterns who are almost feeling like they have to pick one or the other, healthy skin or a bad relationship with food. And you can have a healthy relationship with food and get yourself back to a healthy state of being with your skin as well. But also it underscores, and especially with liver detoxification, that our liver needs nutrients. Specifically in phase 2 liver detox, it is so heavily guided by nutrients, many of which our body doesn't naturally just make. So if we don't have a sufficient supply, or the load coming into the liver is so hefty that it is overrunning those phase 2 detox systems, you will end up with problems. And there's no amount of doing just like a liver detox or doing castor oil packs or coffee enemas is going to fix that, because it does not provide the specific nutrients. And I'm a big fan. I don't know how you feel about this, but I am a big fan of a higher protein intake. And we need nutrients from protein, the amino acids, in order to run many of these liver detox pathways. And if you cannot get phase 2 liver detox up and running efficiently, there is no workaround for that.
So I just want to jump in here because liver phase 1, liver phase 2, et cetera, et cetera. I once heard an analogy from my friend Ryan Carter, Levite on Instagram. Anyway, he once said, liver phase 1 is like you cooking in the kitchen and putting the trash in the bin. If you don't have liver phase 1 working properly, you'll have all this rubbish, garbage building up in the kitchen. Liver phase 2 is when you actually take it out for the trash men to collect outside. And if liver phase 2 doesn't work properly, they don't turn up, it piles up out in your garden and it gets bad. So the point is you need to make sure that both of them are working in synergy. And so I love that analogy, because for the layman, and the majority of us listening to this podcast will be laymen in your area of expertise. So I think just always remember that liver phase 1 and liver phase 2 are so important. And it's a really good analogy anyway. I just wanted to share that for those that are listening.
It is. And I consider it, I kind of like back out maybe a step further and say there's 3 phases of liver detox, because phase 1 is really mostly guided by our genetics. You can manipulate it with food and certain exposures. And then hormones a lot of times are processed through phase 1, but phase 2 is just so nutrient driven. For those who are old enough and remember the TV show I Love Lucy, I always think of phase 2 of Lucy and Ethel at the Bonbon Factory, where they were at the conveyor belt and the chocolate, they were told they had to wrap every single bonbon coming down the conveyor belt. And so the conveyor belt starts going and they're wrapping the bonbons, and eventually it speeds up to a point when where they cannot keep up. They just literally cannot. And so they're stuffing the chocolates in their blouses and their hats in their mouth. And that's essentially what happens, is that we don't have enough wrappers or nutrients in order to get things moving into phase 2. Everything that goes through the liver must go through phase 2. It doesn't all go through phase 1. So some things go through phase 1, Everything then goes through phase 2, and then we go to phase 3, which is excretion, like through urine, the stool, etc. So I just always think of that analogy. I love that visual in case you're like, I don't understand how this is happening. When you see that scene, you're like, oh, now I get it. The body can't keep up with what it's burdened by.
Really interesting. Really interesting. So just to touch before I go on to the next question, I just wanted to touch on that. It's so right about protein. I mean, I'm a fan of higher protein diets, actually, because when you understand what different amino acids do to us, playing around with those and having them in the right ratio for what you need is so important. And obviously proteins are building blocks, and we need different building blocks. And so many people say, well, actually, I don't believe in eating too much protein. And well, the thing is, for me, it's always a clue that we get full up on protein, basically. So if we want to have a self-limiting diet, eat protein because that's what makes you feel faster. And there's a clue in that. And when you're working out or pushing yourself in the gym, you crave more protein foods naturally. And obviously bodybuilders turbocharge this by drinking shakes with ridiculous amounts of calories as well as very high protein. But the clue is right there, I think. And, you only have to supplement with high dose taurine, for instance, or have, TUDCA, for instance, to support your liver. You know how amazing these things are on an individual level. So if, for instance, with the plant-based diet, I understand ethically. I completely get the plant-based diet. Never a question about animal cruelty ever. However, for the right amount of proteins, when you look at plant-based protein amino acid profiles versus meat, for instance, there's so much more abundant in the amino acids we need for these processes. So tell me, what are your thoughts on the vegan diet?
While it's well-meaning, I think it is very misguided in terms of what the body needs in order to thrive. And I understand wanting to take care of the animals, to care for the planet, and all of the beautiful, fluffy, clouded pictures with animals happily grazing in the background. The problem is that as I began my own journey of reintroducing dairy, I found that there is a plethora of animal abuse, worker abuse, environmental concerns that are glossed over whenever you look at different companies' websites and the way that they are ultimately promoting not all, but many of these plant-based alternatives, unfortunately, are processed foods, which is odd to me because 10 years ago, we used to consider fortified foods, so foods where we add nutrients back into them, to be considered processed. And they were things that we were trying to shift people away from them. And yet now somehow we've converted the marketing to this idea that these plant-based foods, because they're natural, they're from the earth, they don't pollute, all of these things that aren't entirely true. We are trying to sell people on highly processed foods with nutrients that are subpar. I will also say that if you look into the cashew industry, it is riddled with worker abuses for specifically female workers who earn almost no money to shell the cashews that we enjoy with bare hands that thus cause caustic, permanent, painful burns to their hands. The workers who harvest and deal with oats that get trapped in the silos and unfortunately suffocate in them. The fact that we rely so heavily on almonds, which in California consume a massive amount of water from their water table. We also heavily spray them, according to, I think, some report from I think it was the FDA. I'm not 100% sure, but it's in my podcast episode. It's something like 86%, something like that, are sprayed with glyphosate, which we know kills bees and pollutes the environment. I am very confused as to how we got away from a balanced diet being really healthy and appropriate for our health in general, but also for our skin. So if a vegan diet works for you and you feel good about eating it, I'm so happy for you. But if it doesn't work for you, that's also okay. And I love animals. I have my own cats. I grow food in my own raised bed gardens in my backyard. And I think we can find a way to balance our needs with what the earth requires as well in order to thrive without necessarily saying that we have to be devoid of animal foods.
So if people are struggling with chronic skin issues, have you got a simple food guide that they can use?
I would say if somebody is looking for an answer to what to eat, the first thing would be to obviously cut out junky foods, processed foods, excess sugar, anything that you're eating that is packaged and processed. If that is making up the majority of your diet, it's a good idea to start thinking about what you can add in that is not necessarily packaged and pre-cooked food. That being said, I really honestly do believe that a varied diet is the best way to go. I'm not going to say that I sit in one camp or the other. I'm to some degree diet agnostic because I sort of believe that we all have to figure out what diet is best for us. However, I do think that most of us do best on an omnivore diet. Depending on how much you eat is really entirely up to you. Where I get concerned when we go too far in the polar opposite directions, right? So either you're going to carnivore or you're going to plant-based is if they work, what are you missing? What are you missing under the surface that is facilitating you to feel better on that particular diet? So one facet of the carnivore diet, which I really truly hope we will see more about, is what happens to the gut microbiome when you don't consume any type of starch or fibers that help your gut microbiome thrive. And while, yes, there have been individuals who do benefit from these diets, when I, in my practice, do stool testing, the gut microbiome looks extremely depleted, like alarmingly depleted. Whereas when you look at those who do a plant-based diet and it's really helped them, I think that's wonderful and I'm happy for you. However, I do want to know why. And a lot of times we see things like H. pylori infections that impact stomach acid production. We see a lot of unfriendly organisms hanging out under the surface. And you can certainly have that on the carnivore side as well. But I just think we need to start asking why. And how can we start to reimagine our diets to be more inclusive of real food and truly making it so that we're not, I don't know, I feel like we've gotten too much into our heads of being so afraid that we're doing the wrong thing. Just eat real food. If you make that 80 to 85% of what you do, I think most of us would be better off. And then you can do all of this other work under the surface to really help you thrive. Right? Because like I said, some things are not diet fixable. And I just want to be very clear about that we can't assume that diet is just like, we can't starve candida. I don't even know why people say that, but we can't with diet. So let's try and find balance with diet and then look under the hood for some of these other issues.
So, Jennifer, what type of detoxes should we avoid?
In terms of detoxes, I would recommend avoiding probably most of them. I just don't think that they're a really great long-term solution to benefit your health. And I would rather people focus on what they could add in that would be sustainable for a long-term solution to support their health. So for example, we were just talking about the benefits of amino acids and protein in the diet. And one amino acid specifically, if we kind of like jump back to that liver detox conversation, that's really important is glycine. And yes, it's available in many protein powders. And yes, it's in a lot of different foods. And yes, it's in your collagen powder. However, I have found in my clinical practice that when you supplement with glycine just on its own, so as a singular amino acid, usually at higher doses, so at least 3 grams a day, if not sometimes twice a day. Sometimes we'll even have clients go up to like 5 grams twice a day, just on its own, in addition to everything else that you're eating. We do find that that can be extremely beneficial. I've had various people who've listened to my podcast and heard me talk about this, who have psoriasis, who have said, oh, I started the glycine. And then I also love to recommend vitamin B6 or P5P, which is, to be honest with you, very difficult to get through foods alone at a more therapeutic dose because it's in such small amount. But the combo of those two nutrients specifically, they can do wonders for liver detoxification. So I've had people who've had psoriasis who have written me and been like, after 3 weeks, my plaques actually are like significantly less red, and I'm actually feeling better. We have clients who are sleeping better. Liver detoxification nutrition is so important for this. Also, too, if we look at our protein sources, if we go back to the point about leaky skin, we need L-histidine. And again, L-histidine is predominantly found in animal foods. You can supplement it with it on your own. However, I would caution someone who is legitimately struggling with histamine intolerance from supplementing with it by themselves, because it is converted directly into histamine and you don't need more histamine in your system.
Yeah.
But you can get a good amount of L-histidine from your diet alone. It's about looking at the right combination of nutrients and really feeding the system, and then knowing where to target the supplements to help nourish the systems that are struggling so that they can do what they need to do. But I will also say that one of the big reasons that liver detox, and specifically that phase 2, becomes overloaded is because the organisms hanging out in the GI tract produce waste, specifically benzoates. Those benzoates go through the portal vein to your liver, where they end up going down phase 2 liver detox, specifically the glycine pathway, where we need glycine. And those are then converted to hippurate so that you can urinate them out. So if you have an issue within the gut where there is excess microbes, it doesn't matter whether it's bacteria or fungus or both or whatever going on. If you have an excess of that, it will contribute drastically to that liver detox overload state, where we need the nutrients to be our bridge between getting things running better, and the ultimate fix is addressing what's happening within the gut itself.
Super, super interesting. Super interesting. So what's your action list for supporting our liver's own ability to detox?
Well, as I said, I'm a big fan of glycine powder. You can take it on its own. It is very sweet to the taste, though it doesn't have any sugar. And I have read some literature about RDs, or registered dietitians, recommending it as almost like a natural sweetener alternative to those who are diabetic, and that there really aren't any long-term issues with supplementing with it. Obviously, don't think more is better and just start taking it all the time. That's not my point. I think sometimes people think, well, she said 3 grams, I'm going to do, 20 grams a day. That's not what I'm saying. We always want to be mindful of sticking with reasonable amounts of supplements. And then if you work with someone, obviously targeting it and getting it dialed in with that person. But I always think 3 to 5 grams once or twice a day, depending on the severity of the skin. I like P5P, which is the active version of vitamin B6. I think it's safe on your own to supplement anywhere from like 10 to maybe even possibly 20 milligrams a day. The only reason I wouldn't suggest going above that without I would say, go ahead of a nutrition professional or a functional doctor or someone you're working with who's looking at your labs, is because you can actually take too much of B6, and it is not one of the B vitamins that if you take too much, it will just get urinated out. You can actually end up with toxicity. So look at all your supplements to see how much is in things. And if you want to add a little boost in there, that can also be really beneficial. Obviously, high sulfur foods are excellent. So animal proteins obviously have a lot of sulfur to them, but we can also look to cruciferous vegetables, onions, garlic. You can even do things like walnuts, dark leafy greens, peaches, apricot, mustard, and obviously certain legumes like lentils, peas, and chickpeas can also be really, really helpful. I also do believe that eggs can be a healthy part of a diet for anybody who's dealing with any skin issues, including eczema. I don't think eggs are bad for eczema. I have plenty of clients that eat eggs. And I also think that dairy can potentially be a healthy part to somebody's diet if they tolerate it and if it works for them. Obviously, looking for the highest quality sources as well. Sometimes fermented dairy may be a better option unless you actually have a dairy allergy. And then magnesium. I think magnesium is another great one you can either supplement with or look for it in different nuts and seeds and such, that can be helpful in general, but also I think all of us could benefit from a little extra magnesium.
I mean, I've actually done quite a lot of content around magnesium, and around 400 enzymatic reactions are controlled by magnesium. And I actually have magnesium IV every few weeks because it just is, my body craves it. And I burn through it. And I think obviously high stress burns through magnesium as well. Something I just wanted to touch on about glycine, actually, and I love that you brought this up, because I remember at Dave Asprey's conference, the Bulletproof Conference in Beverly Hilton, the first year it was there, Dr. McCullough was on stage and he said glycine. He said, perfect for glyphosate, perfect for detoxification. He said, this is a new thing that I'd learned. This was, 2016, 17. And he was like, and this is why it's amazing. Now, I use it as a sweetener for just about everything, like you mentioned. Like, for instance, I have 4 grams a day. I have it in my herbal tea before I go to bed with, the valerian root and things like that. And I found that actually, my digestion and my health has improved significantly since I've had it. And I just use it as a sweetener. So I brought my mum, 250 grams of it last week, actually, so that they can use it in their tea. And so I really like that you're a proponent of glycine.
I'm a huge proponent of glycine, and yes, you can add it into shakes. I love that you add it into teas. You can take it in capsules, but remember that a capsule is like 500 milligrams. So when you're talking about many grams, it does start to add up from a capsule perspective.
And also what it does to your blood glucose spikes compared to obviously normal sugars. So if you do have a slight sweet tooth and you want to trick your senses, I think it's fantastic. I use it so much. So finally, what can the listener do right now to rebuild healthier skin? Because I know that some of the people listening, for instance, I notice frequently that women have acne a lot of the time around a certain age and struggling liver, and then they get on Accutane and then they have more gut issues and then more liver stress opposed to fixing the thing. So, and I see it very frequently, especially in London, actually, and people that have bad skin. And it's not just about taking a medication, as we've talked about, but it can help in the short term. What can people do right now, though?
My first step would be to address the nutritional needs of liver detox, as we discussed, the glycine and the B6. That is one of the foundational things that I recommend. The second thing is the digestion piece, optimizing digestion and making sure that at the least we slow down, we chew our food. If it's a tough food, you're looking probably at 25 to 30 chews per bite. So something like a tougher meat or more fibrous vegetables versus softer foods that could be 5 to 10 chews per bite. And the easiest way to do that is literally to count your chews. And you'll probably quickly find that you're not chewing your food sufficiently enough because you do not have teeth anywhere else in your GI tract. And every step of digestion is unique. There are no backup systems. So it is important to chew your food. Then I would make sure to figure out what's going on with stomach acid. It's very frequent to have low stomach acid or insufficient stomach acid, and some of the symptoms look identical to high stomach acid. So determining which is going on and bringing in like bitters or a digestive enzyme, possibly betaine HCl. But I will caution you, people have to be really careful with betaine HCl because there's like the betaine HCl challenge or test that can actually cause a lot of harm. I don't recommend it. It's where you dose up really high on betaine HCl to see if when you get that burning sensation in your sternum. And first of all, your stomach only generally makes about 2,200 milligrams of stomach acid when you eat. Well, each of those capsules is somewhere around, we'll just say 640 milligrams per capsule of betaine HCl. You can see that really going above 3 to 4 of those capsules is now an excessive amount of acid in the stomach. The problem is we can have silent or asymptomatic gastritis or ulcers, and you can cause an exploding ulcer and end up hospitalized. So please do not dose up higher than like 3 to 4 capsules of those per meal, and really don't do that challenge. It's not worthwhile to do. So figuring out what's going on with stomach acid is really, really crucial. And then look at your protein intake. I would say bare minimum shoot for 70 to 80 grams a day. That's bare minimum. If you can go higher than that and you're looking at close to, I almost sometimes am suggesting like 1 gram of protein per 1 pound of body weight or somewhere in between that. I think that can be really helpful. Anywhere from 30 to possibly 40 grams per meal might be a good way to look at it. But I think those are the most beneficial, easy changes that you can make. And if you don't know how much protein you're taking in, there are plenty of online free websites that can help you tabulate that over the course of like 3 to 5 days. And then you just start making changes, which I've got tons of resources on my website for that as well, for anybody who needs help with it.
I could talk about this forever with you because I love this topic. I think it's an area that people do not talk about enough, and share enough, which is why I really wanted you to come to the summit last year and speak about it. So, Jennifer, it has been an absolute pleasure podcasting with you today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
A massive thank you to my guest, Jennifer Fugo. Learn more about Jennifer at jenniferfugo.com. Check out her podcast, The Healthy Skin Show. You've been listening to the Health Optimization Podcast, and I'm Tim Gray. Comment or leave the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to see more. You can also find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the usual places you like to listen. Check out the show description for extra information and the links. See you next time, and remember, let's spread the health.